You certainly aren't proposing internment camps. I mean,
No,
you don't support what FDR did with internment camps, do you?
I am not proposing that, and that's not what this. If you have to look at his presidential proclamations. It was tough stuff, but it wasn't internment. We're not talking about the Japanese internment camps. No, not at all. But we have to get our hand around a very serious problem, and it's getting worse. And you will have more World Trade Centers, and you will have more bigger than the World Trade Center if we don't toughen up, smarten up, and use our heads.
All right, with us now, MSNBC's Eamon Oldine and Steve Kornacki, along with the news and finance anchor at Yahoo, Bianna Goldriga, and with us from Phoenix, the founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy,
Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He's the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. What perfect timing for these guests.
Eamon, not something you see every day, just what's happened over the past 24 hours. What's your reaction to Donald Trump's interview here?
You know, there's so many ways to look at it. I think, you know, the best way to approach it, I mean, you can look at it from a debate as Americans, you can look at it from the perspective of journalists, and I think I'd prefer to look at it from that perspective, which is more about fact. I don't really have the luxury of speculation and kind of fear-mongering, and I do think that a lot of what Donald Trump is saying is not grounded in fact, and that's the biggest problem. And so much of the way the discussion is manipulated, from the discussion about radical Muslim terrorists to the broader issue of lumping in all Muslims to bouncing around between these ideas back and forth, is the danger in all of this, because the initial statement was extreme, very extreme, and that's his policy perspective. That's how he wants to address the problem of radical Islamic terrorism. Right. But then it gets shrouded in all of this, well, what are we going to do about Muslims? And he starts saying things like, well, they're not helpful. That's not accurate. If you speak to law enforcement officials, they will tell you that by some estimates, as much as 40% of substantial terrorist plots that have been foiled in the U.S. have been as a result of direct tips coming from Muslim Americans to law enforcement agencies. And when you compare that with the broader issues of the policy perspective, like what he wants to do against ISIS, what he wants to do in the Middle East, the facts don't add up. And that's, I think, the most disheartening thing to look at. I'm not even looking at it from the perspective of a Muslim American, where people have all kinds of views and values about the Constitution. So
Dr. Jasser, I'm just looking at your immediate response to the interview that we just did with Donald Trump, and saying that he loves us is patronizing and sophomoric, and you say you are part of the solution. I don't think he disagreed with that, but tell us more about what you think.
Well, I have to tell you, as a naval officer and as a conservative, I listen to this, and this is not conservatism. This is blind nativist demagoguery. And unfortunately, certainly Muslims have not been stepping up to the plate. Certainly we need a tough love. But the narrative of America being the land of immigrants, the narrative of America being that city on the hill, is conservatism. What you're hearing from Mr. Trump actually is very similar to what we hear from Hillary Clinton, but just the other side of the coin, which is that Islam is this monolith. One says we can't offend it, which marginalizes reformers and many of us who are trying to fix the ideology against political Islam. And the other side now is saying that we're all one group, that are all part of the problem. And unfortunately, it's so superficial. A commander-in-chief who wants to lay out a strategy and wants to educate America about how Muslims are going through that same time in history that our founding fathers did against theocracy. If you want to enable a strategy of solutions, you don't do that by just labeling all us as one. You might want to say, put a pause button on refugees, but the bottom line is on all, not just Muslims, because, by the way, our enemies are not just ISIS. It includes Syrian Essidists, it includes Baathists, it includes Russian sympathizers and others. So this is just sophomoric, and it really shows somebody who's really not ready to lead.
And, you know, listening to Donald Trump's plan remind me of stories that my parents told me about life growing up in the Soviet Union, where your nationality was defined by your religion. And as Jews, it wasn't just your official documents that were, labeling you as Jewish. It was your library card that labeled you as Jewish. So hearing this again, it's very frustrating and it's very scary. And Willie asked him specifically, what is that going to entail? Is somebody's passport going to have to say that they're Muslim? He said, no, we'll just ask you when you try to come to this country, and then, you'll say yes or no. That's not going to happen. So listening to that part of his plan is the most frightening, of course, even comparing that to the tactics of the Soviet times.
Steve, none of it's going to happen. None of it. I mean, it's unconstitutional, and it would never pass through, wouldn't get 50 votes in the House. It's never going to happen, and yet you have people out there screaming for it on the campaign trail.
It's a bombastic piece of rhetoric, although one thing he said that did strike me was, you're talking about the condemnation from other Republicans, which is pretty universal, but he made the point of saying he didn't think it was coming from every candidate, and that did catch me yesterday, too. I noticed they all said, nobody said, I agree with this. Nobody said, I want this to happen. But you had Jeb Bush, who was saying he's unhinged. You had Lindsey Graham. Ted Cruz made a very simple statement, said, no, I don't agree with it, and did not want to say anything else.
Rand Paul also stayed away.
That's right. That's right.
Those were the two candidates that stayed away from it.
But what strikes me about that is when you look at like Kasich, Graham, Bush offering the biggest condemnation of this, add them up and they're at about 12% in the polls. Cruz pretty much stays away from it. Trump says this. Add them up and they're at about 50% in the polls. I thought that was interesting.
Doctor, you say you're a conservative. I guess you can take some solace in the fact that the overwhelming majority of Republicans oppose these policy proposals that Donald Trump is putting forward. But how do you get your message to those 75% of Republicans on what they should be saying as a counterweight to what Trump supporters are saying?
That's a great question. I think both parties hopefully will reach out to. We have a Muslim reform movement that's bipartisan that includes many leaders like Azra Nomani and others who you've spoken to. And it's not just about conservatives, it's about liberals. It's about the ideas of equality of men and women. It's about progressive ideas of free speech against blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, etc. This is not party politics. And yet the Muslim minority, just because we're 1% of the population in America, becomes a ping pong between the left and the right. Meanwhile, a quarter of the world's population is going through seizures after the Arab awakening, and we need a commander-in-chief, and I think many other candidates are looking at how to say this strategically and use the campaign as a time for education, as teaching moments to say this is how we engage Muslims like the Muslim reform movement. And unfortunately, we're not being paid attention to, and unfortunately one candidate gets her talking points from the Qatar Foundation and Islamists who want to lump us all in as with the theocrats and let them have the voice. And the other candidate wants to marginalize us, who, by the way, has some hypocritical stances when he's doing business with Trump Dubai and other billion-dollar corporations that are actually enslaving Muslims and other things. So it's just such a hypocrisy, and we're not dealing with true core solutions from either party.
And we're also not getting the message out. I mean, Eamon, Muslim Americans, there's such an entrepreneurial class there that are a part of the American dream, or pursuing the American dream, or what the American dream was all about.
I think when you look at the numbers that are put out either by economic institutes and whatever, and that focus on some of these Arab American institutes, they always show you that the numbers of the Muslim immigrants and Muslim Americans who've grown up here, they have a very entrepreneurial spirit. They contribute, they're extremely productive contributors to society. They play very important roles in business. We know they play an incredible important role in government in terms of diplomacy, in terms of linguistics, interpreters, analysts in the intelligence community.
By the way, helping win the war against terror.
Absolutely. And we talked about this last hour. Muslim Americans are on the front lines of American war on terror. They are fighting every day, sacrificing their lives. I showed you this picture of an American Marine who tweeted at Donald Trump saying, here's my Muslim registration ID, and it was his picture of his armed forces ID, and said, where is yours, Donald Trump? So, I think it's a very poignant message that it gets lost in this type of debate, because you have everybody focusing on one person's, as Steve mentioned, bombastic comments, divisive comments, and in the end we lose sight of the fact that there are millions of Muslim Americans sacrificing as much as anybody else in this country, and in some cases more than some of our own politicians.
And Steve, that's a message that's not only heard in New Hampshire or South Carolina, it's a message it's heard around the world, unfortunately.
Yeah, although it is an interesting moment when you hear all of the voices that are out there. The discussion we're having right now, it does make me wonder, when you look at some of the public opinion poll and asking Americans, do you think that Islam is fundamentally compatible with American values? You see, there's been large numbers have been saying no. And I do wonder if Donald Trump making a comment like this and causing a discussion like this might start to change those numbers.
Eamon Moldeen, Steve Kornacki, thank you. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, thank you as well.